Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy in Future. And today my guest is a distinguished professor, expert in the field of security, Professor Hugh White. Hi, Hugh. How are you?
Hi, Jacek. I'm very well. How are you?
How is down there in Australia these days?
Well, it's not too bad. I mean, where spring is bursting, and after what is by our standards, not by yours, a very cold winter, we're enjoying a bit of warm weather, and of course, enjoying the spectacle, if that's the right word, of the US election. And we've got an election of our own coming up in about 6 months' time. So the politics here are starting to get a bit interesting as well.
I understand. Since you're entering spring, we are entering here the autumn. So this is
Yes,
how the cycle of the world operates. But this is, how it has been with us since the beginnings, so to speak.
yes,
Okay, we have agreed with Hugh that we will uh, kind of set out three main factions, I would say, behind the US politics as we kind of diligently watch the kind of the backdoor discussions in the US, how to deal with China, and what is the US posture after the election. So let me kind of try to propose the following. I will tell you what we think, what will happen after the elections, and you will say whether we are right and what are the details of this being wrong or being right. Okay, that
Oh,
will be
okay.
an interesting exercise. So we think that there are three main factions, in strictly speaking, in terms of the US posture towards the world and how to
Yep.
deal with the rise of China. Faction number one, we would call it a verbal primacy. Verbal primacy, and that is as it has been recently. Okay, so verbally, we are the arsenal of democracy. We do it, we provide, we compete, but basically nothing too much happening in terms of internal reforms. No too much of the rise of troops in the Western Pacific. No change to the course of the Ukrainian war in Ukraine. Basically, this is what Biden has been saying, so to speak. President Biden has been saying, and
Yep.
what I feel Kamala Harris is saying, and the bureaucracy in DC has been saying, more or less, yeah, kind of.
Yes. Yes.
The second faction is Neoreaganism. We call it Neoreaganism.
Yep.
That was unveiled in a famous article on in many places, but for example, in the famous article in Foreign Affairs, that we are the superpower, and basically those are often people behind Trump, but it's not entirely along the lines with the candidates, more or less, but basically those factions in DC. Rise of troops in the Western Pacific, including deployment of troops into Taiwan, and including boosting nuclear weaponry, including deployment to Taiwan, to show resolve and prepare for the naval blockade of the Chinese coast, and full decoupling, economic decoupling, no matter costs, no matter what happens next, because there is
Yep.
no other way. We can't
Yep.
live together with a so-called communist China under the same sun, either us or them, but we will strangle them as we did to the Soviet Union in the 80s, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Europeans must follow because they are security importers of us, so they need to follow. And the
Yes.
faction number three is 𝗙𝗵ism. Let me, of course, put it that way. So, offshore balancing from Europe because Europeans are rich enough and they can handle the Russians. Plus, we need some space for Russians to kind of negotiate things so that they are not too close to China. And also, we don't have resources to deal with so many challenges at one time. We need to have some internal reforms. And we cannot propose the offensive posture in the Western Pacific. So let it be just the kind of the island defense so that we
Yeah.
consolidate alliances. So the Japanese, Taiwanese really want to invest in military because we will be there, but it will not be about naval blockades. It will be just to consolidate status quo, so to speak, so that the Chinese do not expand influence. Okay, that's it. What do you think about those?
Well, I think it's a very good framework. I think you've characterized in the first scenario, verbal primacy. I think you've characterized very accurately where we've been over the now nearly 4 years of the Biden administration. A clear rhetorical commitment to leadership, although not much definition of what that actually means, but no substantive action in the Western Pacific to address the real challenge, and I would say a very inadequate response commitment in Eastern Europe on your eastern borders to the nature and scale of the challenge that Russia has posed. And I think what strikes me about that scenario is how deeply embedded it is in what you might call the culture of the Beltway, particularly on the Democrat side. That is a very great reluctance to let go of the language of primacy, to let go of the language of leadership, and an equally strong reluctance, refusal, I think one could say, to commit the resources and to run the risks that I think are going to be required in order to sustain that position. And I think that is therefore standing the kind of rhetorical support that it's received from allies, for example, in East Asia, including from Australia. I think that remains a fundamentally very fragile position. But if you have to ask me where I think Kamala Harris would locate the United States were she to win, and I don't take that for granted by any means, then I think, put it this way, I've seen no evidence that she or the people around her have a clear recognition of the inherent weakness of the position she'll be inheriting from the Biden administration. And therefore, I see no evidence that they're going to do anything very significantly different. The Neoreaganism, I think, is also, a very apt characterization of, so to speak, the alternative view. So what you have in Washington at the moment, in contrast or in opposition to the verbal primacy idea, is the thought that America can return to the peace through strength idea, the idea that America has the strength and has the imperative to respond to China and to that, for that matter, to Russia, but particularly to China, with sufficient strength to essentially neutralize China's challenge and restore US primacy. And I think it would be fair to say that, and I'd be interested in your views on this, but it seems to me that the most influential proponents of that neo-Reaganism approach tend also to be strong Asia first proponents. They tend to be the people who think that America should be focusing most of its efforts in Asia because China is the primary rival, a more serious rival than the United States. The thing that strikes me about that is that although the neo-Reaganites are very determined, or very committed, rhetorically committed at least, to the idea of America putting in a much bigger effort, I don't see the evidence that they really understand how big an effort would be required. That is, I don't see them arguing. They argue, for example, for increased US defense spending. They argue for increased US commitments and deployments, as your scenario suggested. But I don't think they recognize how big those additional commitments would have to be. And I also don't think they recognize how big the risks involved are. Because what you don't hear them saying is, what you don't hear them doing is setting out in clear, unambiguous terms just how big a military commitment, for example, the United States would have to make to the Western Pacific to put itself in a position where it could, with real confidence, confront a Chinese maritime challenge over Taiwan, for example. That would require a massive, massive military effort on America's part. It would also require it to be very fast, because America doesn't have decades to do this build-up. It has to work really quickly. It would also require the United States, I think, to much more frankly acknowledge the nature and scale of the nuclear challenge that China poses, to take the kind of approach towards China which the Neo-Reaganites suggest. They would, it seems to me, have to really acknowledge that the strategic contest with China is a strategic contest with a nuclear power with a capacity, and of course, a rapidly increasing capacity, to place nuclear weapons on American cities. And the United States has to recognize that any conflict with China over an issue as critical to China as Taiwan would run a real risk, not a certainty, but a real risk of escalating across the nuclear threshold. And no president, no US president, no US administration could go into that kind of conflict without recognizing a significant risk to beyond a theatre exchange to a full-scale strategic exchange targeting respective homelands. And I think for the Neo-Reaganites to really present a really viable, credible, compelling alternative to the verbal primicists that we've seen under the Biden administration, I think we'd have to see a very frank acknowledgement that this really is another Cold War, in this respect at least. Lots of differences from the old Cold War, but it has this in common, and that is that nuclear weapons sit at the heart of the strategic confrontation, and only a country that can absolutely convince their rivals of their willingness to fight a nuclear war, including a nuclear war in which their own cities would be targeted, has a chance of prevailing or even preventing the other side from prevailing in such a contest. Now, the other thing I think that's really interesting about the Neo-Reaganism model is that, as you mentioned, there are lots of serious Republicans who talk in this way, but there are two who it seems to me don't. Well, one is J.D. Vance, the other is Donald Trump. And Trump in particular, I think, is the real key here. The thing about Trump is that although he's been very anti-China, of course, and the whole identification of China as a first-order strategic rival, the elevation of China as a strategic rival to the primary position in America's strategic mission statement and so on, all happened under the Trump administration. It's very striking to me that Trump himself has almost self-identified China as a strategic as opposed to an economic rival. And he's never expressed deep commitment to the idea of preserving US leadership. And so although if Trump wins in November, there'll be lots of people around him, lots of people who want to get into his administration, who will take the sort of neo-Reaganist approach. It's just unclear that Donald Trump will be one of them. And that leaves the fascinating question, how Trumpian will a second Trump administration be? Now, there's been a kind of an orthodox argument around that a second Trump administration would be more Trumpian. That is, it would bear the marks of Donald Trump's own ideas more clearly than the first one, because the first one they didn't really expect to win, and they had very chaotic government processes, and lots of people working in the administration didn't really support what Trump was on about anyway, and they often frustrated what he was trying to do. Whereas the thought has been that a second Trump administration would be better prepared, even if you didn't go along with the Heritage Foundation's Agenda 2025 project, you could make the argument that the people who would staff a second Trump administration would be closer to Trump's own ideas. Now, that might be right. And if that's so, then I think the chances of the neo-Reaganism approach being really influential in a second Trump administration would be very low. But it might turn out to be right. On the other hand, it may be that we'll get strong characters like Pompeo, for example, who I think is a very interesting figure in American politics. He's been very, very quiet this year, but I don't think that means he's not interested in what's going on. And influential and impressive strategic thinkers like 𝗙𝗵𝗁𝗏, who may manage to get hold of the agenda and pursue that kind of model. The question though is whether whether they would succeed in pushing the United States to make the kind of effort that would really this as a viable strategy, where they'd really be willing to commit the resources. And the other question, of course, is how would China respond? Because I think one of the reasons why the Chinese have taken a relatively patient approach to turning up the pressure on the United States in the Western Pacific, which is, I think, their long-term strategy, is that they've felt the time has been on their side. That is, that their strength, particularly their military strength, has been growing, and their economic strength, for that matter, has been growing faster than America's. And therefore, to defer the confrontation to, following years, subsequent times, works to China's advantage. But if America were credibly to start adopting a kind of neo-Reaganism approach, that would give China a clear incentive to move faster. And I think if China moved, within the next couple of years, for example, by bringing on a serious confrontation over Taiwan, or for that matter, even a more serious confrontation over one of the second-order flashpoints like Second Thomas Shoals, that would confront US policymakers with a very difficult choice, which I don't think they've really put their head around. I'd also just make the point that I think under whatever other mysteries may be embedded in the future of a Harris administration, I think the chance of it taking a neo-Reaganist approach is very slender. And that brings me to the third one. What was your label for the third?
𝗙𝗵𝗂𝗵. It's like 𝗙𝗵𝗁𝗏, that this
yes,
offshore ban.
Okay. Well, I think, 𝗙𝗵 is, as I say, I think there's quite a lot of 𝗙𝗵ism already in the second scenario. When I look at, although it's often, they talk a lot about having to confront Russia too, some of them, but when you read between the lines, the determination to do what Reagan did, to really not just muddle through, but to win, I think carries with it, even if only implicitly, a determination to focus on the big one, and the big one is China, and in a sense to leave America to deal with, to leave Europe to deal with Russia, because Russia, Europe's strategic weight, in theory at least, on paper, is adequate to deal with the Russian problem, and let America get on with the main rival. So I think there's a lot of connections of the 𝗙𝗵 approach and neo-Reaganism, but to the extent that they're separate, I think there is a natural resting place for US policy, in which they do, moving off from some, so to speak, talk big, do nothing approach of the verbal primacists. There is a natural midpoint between that and the neo-Reaganists, which I think is what you're identifying in the 𝗙𝗵ism, which is that America does enough to sustain a significant position in the Western Pacific, a balancing position in the Western Pacific, in supporting its offshore allies, the Japanese in particular, and also Australia to a certain extent. South Korea I'm less sure of, but we can come back to that, because South Korea is not offshore. It's on the continent, which I think makes a big difference. But it's a vision of the United States sustaining a significant strategic role in Asia, but somewhat more constrained because China is not defeated the way the neo-Reaganists would like to do it. And if you like, it's what the verbal primacists would be doing if they had the determination, the flair, the will, whatever, the judgment to see US defense spending go back up to 5 or 6%, and to really start providing the kind of, really substantial expansion of the US military posture in the Western Pacific that would be necessary to achieve the deterrence that that Washington keeps on talking about, but has so far failed to provide. And I guess, I mean, the last point I'd make is that, so it's a perfectly viable model. And it's possible to imagine either a Harris administration coming from verbal primacy or a Trump administration which was determined to do something more about China but didn't have Trump's support to go the whole way to the Neoreaganism extravaganza. It's possible to see either of them landing on that point. But can I offer you a fourth scenario?
Yeah, just there is also one element that sometimes in our simulations kicks in that may unfortunately bring together those two or three even scenarios into one major confrontation. And
Yes.
or at least, the thinking in DC may follow along those lines, because we think that in order to confront China big time, it's less of the armaments and less of Reagan style, because the structure of the world was entirely different in those old times. So the United States will really need to embark on the financial war against China, either to sustain primacy or to impose this Neoreaganism kind of posture. The United States will need to really embark on a major financial war, including even unlawful acts, of course, unlawful in terms of the current understanding what's unlawful. And remember that Vance proposed this when he was not a candidate in May. He proposed to run with the legislation, reminding everybody that the Republic of China, I mean, all China, prior to Mao, owes to the United States a lot more money than the United States owes to China now, and they should return this money. Or ideas that there should be an invoice issued for the COVID, And other ideas like Robert Lighthizer proposes, tariffs, but denying the access to the U.S. capital markets, making the ownership of assets temporary for the Chinese investors. All those, there are many, because the Americans think that they control the edifice of the world capitalism and the financial market. Through Wall Street and other institutions and the Bretton Woods system, they think that they are in charge of this field of confrontation, and this is the heart of the organism. So what I fear when I speak of the world peace, that even in this verbal primacy, they will reach for the instruments to,
That's possible. That's possible. I guess I'd make two observations about it. The first is and I'm not an economist, but it's far from clear to me that America's position in that kind of contest is as strong as advocates of that kind of, so to speak, all-out economic war believe. I mean, one very important point is that very few countries will follow America that far. Certainly, no one in Asia will, not even Japan. The Japanese have reluctantly, and the South Koreans for that matter, have reluctantly gone along with the United States on some of these things, like the restrictions on ship exports and so on. But these are countries whose economies are very heavily, and of course this includes Australia, these are countries whose economies are very heavily dependent on trade with China. And for whom China remains, for all of its problems, the principal source of future economic opportunities. Whereas the United States offers people nothing by way of future economic opportunities. States cannot do is to combine that kind of economic warfare with the continued protectionism, which has been the really significant economic dynamic in Washington, and of course, continuously over the Trump and Biden years. And, the idea that, certainly the countries in Southeast Asia, and for that matter, I would think India and countries elsewhere, Africa and so on, would just not follow the United States down that path. Now, I don't know enough about how the functions of the dollar as the reserve currency, the way capital markets work. I don't know enough about how they function to know how far the United States could nonetheless, without the support of all those other countries, do China the kind of damage it would need to do in order to make a significant headway in containing China's challenge, containing China's strategic challenge. But my starting point would be that absolutely remains to be seen, and I'm skeptical. The Chinese economy is very big, and the arrangement of the world capital markets, although it dates back to the 1940s and so on, that can change. And I think the chances of America being able to make that work are very low. The second point is that I don't think you can assume that if America tries to win the contest with China on the economic battlefield, that the Chinese won't respond by moving to the strategic battlefield. As they say in staff colleges, the enemy has a vote. If what America is trying to do really imposes the costs on China of a scale that would be required to convince China to fundamentally change its strategic ambitions, then it would be inflicting enough pain on the Chinese for the Chinese to really respond kinetically. And that gets us back to the point we touched on a little earlier. In the end, China has a number of advantages over the United States, but the most important is that it cares more about what happens in the Western Pacific than America does. And its threats to go nuclear are therefore more credible than America's are. And what America has failed to do over the years of verbal primacy has been to do anything like the kind of thing it did in the Cold War, to convince the Chinese today, as they convinced the Soviets during the Cold War, that it really is willing to fight a nuclear war to defend its interests in a distant theater of confrontation. The miracle, if you like, of the Cold War, one of them, was that the United States convinced the Pentagon, the Kremlin, that they were willing to fight a nuclear war that would involve the destruction of major US cities in order to defend West Berlin. And they did. They convinced the Soviets of that, and that's why the Cold War most of the time stayed pretty stable. And of course, the Soviets convinced the Americans vice versa. But the way the Americans did that, with a kind of massive investments and massive commitments and a very explicit acknowledgement of the risks and costs they were prepared to bear. You think of the sort of speeches that Kennedy gave in 1961 over the West Berlin crisis, or for that matter, the speeches he gave over Cuba, but particularly over West Berlin. They were very explicit acknowledgements to the American people of the risk of nuclear war that would involve the destruction of their cities, and the American citizens accepted it. Now, if American political leaders under either of those scenarios are prepared to be that frank with Americans, and if the American public accepts it, then maybe the Chinese would be convinced. But absent that, I don't think the economic lever gives America, so to speak, a cheap and easy way to achieve what it can't achieve in the military space, because I think the Chinese are apt to jump from one to the other.
True, but let me remind you, Hugh, that Trump, even during the debate with Harris, or maybe in one of his interviews right prior to that, told to the audience and to the world that if the US allies do not trade in US dollars, they will be punished by 100% tariffs on the
Yes.
This is the
weaponization of the dollar. No, that's true. But it would be interesting to see how countries respond to that, because trade with America, for countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia, trade with America is just not that important.
Yes,
it's just so and that's partly an artifact of America's own policy.
True. But let me be even more challenging for you, if you permit me, please.
Please.
Look, we are quite sober in discussing as of now, right? You and me discussing all those, but still, your Australia made choices in that context that seemed unreasonable, both in terms of AUKUS, now I heard about that you want to buy this new bomber from the United States. They're kind of all those submarines that will be patrolling the South China Sea, and you will be the first to enter the war with China if something happens with this posture. Why I'm saying it and teasing you a little bit, because what I fear is self-denial in the sea. They apparently think, and I also talk to people from the heritage, they really think that they are in charge of the world affairs, including the financial system, and it's only about their political will whether they really want to embark on it or not. And
look, it's a really interesting point, and I don't dismiss it at all. That they might think that they can do that, and I can see how. I can see the attractions, particularly because the strategic motive of trying to respond to China's challenge is reinforced by a domestic political motive, because protectionism and everything that sails with it is very attractive politically. I mean, the whole history of the second half of the 20th century was the extraordinary political effort. Well, not the whole history, but a big part of the history was the extraordinary political effort to keep the political genie of protectionism bottled up, and that's now been unbottled. So I don't doubt for a moment that there's a significant risk that people in Washington, D.C. believe that this offers them a route to achieve a significant strategic victory over China. What I doubt is that it'll work. And the question then is, how self-correcting will the US system be when they embark on this policy? How long does it take them to realize that it's not working, and how catastrophic do things get before they recognize this? I mean, I do think, and this goes back a long way. It sounds a bit melodramatic, I guess, but I do think that we face a Washington today that has a proven tendency to make very significant strategic errors. And this could be another one. I mean, they made massive strategic errors in Iraq and Afghanistan, you might say in Vietnam as well. They've made, I think, significant strategic errors in the way they've responded to the tragedy of Ukraine. That's a different story, but and I think they've made fundamental strategic errors in the way they've approached China over many decades. And so I don't at all rule out the possibility that they might make further strategic errors of the sort you're describing. And of course, part of that is I think there's a significant risk that things will end very badly, either economically or kinetically, or both.
In that vein, let me set out what happened next in our simulation after choosing the factions, okay? Because we ran through the simulations of the future, of our strategy in future. That will be a good moment after we have discussed it a bit. So in this verbal primacy, depending on the posture of Europe, of the decision of the European decision makers, whether we decouple from China or hesitate, or we strongly say no to decoupling, and we even continue trading with China to the fullest, including even the international treaty, the history will fork. If Europe is on the side of the United States, or the Americans will think that they will force Europe to be on the United States side because Europe hesitates, then United States will put additional pressure on China. And the Chinese will be thinking that they will need to do something to undermine the US edifice of credibility worldwide, which is the centerpiece of its power, to convince Europeans and Japanese. And they will impose what they will do is the quarantine of Taiwan by showing selective quarantine, when they can decide whether they phase it out or phase it more, just so that they could prove to the world that the United States is not in control of events anymore. So this will be a kind of a crawling path towards war over Taiwan, but without Japan, without Japan, because the Chinese will do everything in their might to separate the interests of the Japanese and the United States and win a 7-day war over the United States if the United States decides to run the quarantine.
Yes.
And that's like Tsushima kind of thing, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
In the second scenario, this Neoreaganism, we have a full race of armaments, including nuclear weapons. And there's a great chance of the major of the incidents in South China Sea or somewhere else that evolves into a full-blown war, including nukes, use of nuclear weapons, because of this phase issue, the difference of risk and the result that you touched upon a bit.
Yeah.
And the Chinese will even be inclined to use nuclear weapons against Guam, kind of to show the resolve, because what can the Americans strike at? Shanghai, Xiamen? And the Chinese will do it, not because they are cruel, but in our simulation, because they will be thinking that the Americans are thinking that they have superiority in nuclear, that the Americans have the superiority in nuclear arsenal, so they can always terminate the conventional war at their choosing, and the Chinese will want to kind of liquidate this feeling. You know how that works, and
absolutely,
Armageddon, and everything goes in flames. What do you think?
Okay, look, I think I think the way in which
in the second scenario, the Chinese will be strategically compelled to strike Japan also preventively, Japanese bases in Japan, because the major boosts in armaments, a lot of stationing of U.S. troops in Japan, so that Japan will be, without their will, in the war. Okay.
Touch on the Japanese predicament just in both scenarios first. I mean, it seems to me that I should first say that should things come to a confrontation over Taiwan, I think the scenario you sketch in the first case, that China goes not for an invasion but for a blockade or a quarantine, I think that's highly credible. I've never thought that the most cost-effective strategic option for Beijing would be invasion. Beijing is very well placed to impose a close blockade, quarantine of Taiwan, which doesn't mean they starve the Taiwanese. It just means that everything that goes to Taiwan has to come from China, and the Chinese, I think, could easily manage that. And I've always thought that we don't want to oversimplify attitudes towards China in Taiwan. There's a great deal of resistance and fear and so on, but it's still a significant portion of the population votes for the KMT. So I think that kind of political pressure, militarized political pressure, could easily be quite attractive to China. So I think that's a very important point. The second point I'd make in relation to Japan's predicament is actually, I think, in either scenario, either a quarantine scenario or a full-scale war in the Neo-Reaganite model, China has a very attractive option of going to the Japanese at the beginning of the war and saying, here's the deal. You don't allow America to operate out of your territory and we won't attack you. You do allow America to operate out of your territory and your bases will be destroyed, and so will some of your cities. And I think in that situation, Japan has a very difficult choice to make, and I think it would be very unwise for Americans to assume that the Japanese decide to stick with America and don't take China's deal, because it seems to me that Chinese proposition is very credible, and that's a big problem for America under either scenario, because losing the Japanese bases would be disastrous for them. So just to go back a couple of steps. I mean, I think the real challenge for Europe, now let me put it the other way, the real challenge for America in a situation in which it's trying to pressure Europe to support Europe in a much stricter economic confrontation with China, and to persuade Europe to make real economic sacrifices in order to support America against China economically. The real problem with America doing that on the basis of threatening that if Europe doesn't do what America wants against China, then America will abandon its strategic commitments to Europe, is that I don't think America's strategic commitments to Europe are worth very much. And this is something we've discussed before. It doesn't seem to me that the United States has really compelling strategic imperatives to defend Europe from Russia, for example. In particular, because Russia today is nothing like the rival it was in the Cold War. It's much more constrained by strong neighbours, including by Europe itself. Europe doesn't need America to defend itself against Russia. If Europe could act cohesively, which of course is not something to be taken for granted, but it's clearly possible, then the Europeans can contain Russia themselves. And so if I was a European, I would be very reluctant to sacrifice a very important economic relationship with China for a strategic undertaking, which in the end doesn't seem very valuable. Yeah. You know, Joe Biden said, in words of one syllable, all the way back months before the invasion, that he wasn't prepared to fight World War III for Ukraine. Well, if he wasn't prepared to fight World War III for Ukraine, why would he fight World War III for Poland? And don't tell me that it's because Poland's a NATO member. That puts the cart before the horse.
Yeah, and in the Western Pacific, on top of that.
Oh, likewise, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole, basis of my position on these things.
And with the destruction of the European social contract in the process.
Yeah.
This is what I think what Macron consistently stated this year.
Yeah.
But you know what? The situation in Europe is really, the social contract is breaking down, I mean,
yeah, no,
the energy crisis, because of the, the kind of the end of globalization, and Europe lived off globalization kind of, and now with this Chinese and new technology, so there is a major reshuffle of understanding who we are in Europe now. I don't know what's going to happen out of that, how it comes out of this. But it is true that I think that the US nuclear extended guarantees that are the bulwark of our security it's a bluff, and the conventional deterrence capabilities are underperforming.
So that's a polite way of putting it.
And I'm not sure if there is a full realization of this reality in the circles. Macron understands that. Some some Germans understand that. I'm not sure if it's understood here on NATO Eastern Flank, because the fear of Russia is so strong. And they don't, you know what I mean? It's very difficult.
Yes, that's right. Yes, no, it's hard. And of course, in Western Europe, there's just the weight of habit. They've been, on the other side of the old Iron Curtain. They've been depending on the United States since before most of their parents were born. And I think for people in Germany, in Britain, and even to a certain extent in France, notwithstanding their somewhat different trajectory and traditions, and Italy and so on, the idea of not depending on the United States is it's almost unthinkable. And of course, the same is true here. I think for you guys, from the former Warsaw Pact, it's the other thing. It's still new. It's still exciting. It's still so important to the way you've redefined your identities in the post-Soviet era. And so, although it's but it's equally powerful, and I can really understand that, because I mean, hey, I come from Australia, where our emotional attachment to the US alliance is as strong as anybody's. But I think what we all have to recognize is that the United States is not now the country we believed it was in the 1990s. And we're still skating along on the assumptions and expectations of the 1990s. And of course, and so are the people in Washington. I mean, that's the problem. That's the origins of all of those scenarios. They're all in different ways based on a misunderstanding of the relationship between America's objectives on the one hand and its resources and will on the other.
True, just a nice description of Polish elites' attitude towards it. First, they thought that there was an end to history, so free ride.
Yep.
Then there was, in that there was a strategic adoption by the United States and NATO that our leaders didn't need to take care about the primary objective of any state to survive, physical defense, and so on. And those guys took over. We are on the safe side.
Yep.
And macroeconomics, the second tier, was it was adoption by the European Unions.
Yes.
So our guys didn't need to make key decisions that are a daily business for normal countries.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And I mean, in different ways, although I think your experience was so spectacular because of the swiftness and radicalness of the shift. But you could see the same thing here in Australia. Back in the 80s, Australian defence policy was based on genuine skepticism about whether or not, if we had a local problem, say with Indonesia, America would come to our aid. And we certainly didn't presuppose that America was going to be our economic savior. But by the time we got into the late 90s, we believed that all we needed to do was to stick with the United States strategically and stick with the United States economically. The United States was running the show. China was growing, but that's fine because it was under America's thumb. It was all just, and we really did. We think, the idea of a holiday from history was for real. And we're all wrestling with the fact that that's not proven to be correct, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
So that's just going back to your scenario. I think the idea that Europe can be convinced to really radically sacrifice its economic interests in globalization, which is what's really at stake here, a global free trade system, which Europe has, as you say, done so well and been so successful, that it can sacrifice that in exchange for American security guarantees. I think that's way too optimistic on America's part, because I don't think anyone regards American security guarantees as that worthwhile. And the test, of course, is that there's a great incentive for China, and I think this is embedded in your first scenario, for China to generate a test which demonstrates to America's allies that it's not trustworthy.
True.
And
exactly.
That's always seemed to me to be the real dynamics of the situation in the Western Pacific, that in places like Taiwan and the Senkakus and the South China Sea, the Chinese have set up a series of situations in which America has declared itself committed to support a situation. The Philippines place and the rusting hulk on second Thomas Shoal, for example, and essentially invited the Chinese to call their bluff by the Chinese actually taking some kinetic military action. And at some time of the Chinese own choosing, the Chinese will put it to the test and face an American president, whoever he or she might be, with the choice as to whether they're prepared to risk a war with China, which could very easily escalate in exactly the way you described, over a rusty hulk on a half-submerged reef.
Yeah.
And, the last time America thought about that, over Scarborough Shoals in 2012, they decided it wasn't worth it. And whether a US president is really willing to go to war over that, when he wasn't prepared to fight World War III over Ukraine, is, I think, put it this way, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese think it is a bluff and decide to call it. And the danger then is that whoever's in the Oval Office or whoever's in the Situation Room decides they have to go ahead anyway. And that's why the risk of war, I think, is really quite real.
Yeah, I concur. Thank you very much, Hugh. Our professor was Professor Hugh White. A spectacular discussion. Thank you for your insights.
Well, thank you. It's been a great pleasure as always.
Take care, and my greetings to those spring in Australia.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy the ensuing winter. It's not too grim for you all. But great to talk again, Jacek.
Yeah,
great.
Take care, likewise. Take care.
See you later. Bye-bye.